Okay, so this is the sort of weekend version of the weekend video for Gatsby's chapters 5 and 6. By weekend, I mean at the end of the week, not obviously Saturday, Sunday. But we're going to kind of be looking at just a few key points. So obviously in these chapters, one of the big things is we're setting up to one of the big moments here. It's, of course, Gatsby getting a chance to meet Daisy again for the first time. Now these 5 years later. So at the beginning, obviously Gatsby feels very at edge here. He's like, this is all built up in his mind so much. He's had to work so hard to get to this point, and now he actually has to make it happen. So first of all, he seems to feel very almost like in debt to Nick with everything that's going on. He keeps asking him all these things like, do you want to go to Coney Island? Do you want to come over for a swim? Can I get you some work? By the way, the work that he's offering, that is basically a way of offering, some amount of money for that would be really easy to get, is probably laundering money because, as I brought up before, Gatsby is a bootlegger. That's why everything seems kind of fishy with Wolfsheim. And the other stuff that's going on, especially if you watch the movie, there's multiple times in that first party that his butler guy comes up to him and says, Chicago's on the line, and it's real hush-hush. That these are all these different areas where he has these, basically drugstores that he sells alcohol out of as a bootlegging operation. So again, he's trying to kind of bring Nick into that. I don't think he's trying to bring Nick in because he wants to make Nick a criminal with him, but I think it's just that this is the only thing that he has to offer. But then Nick goes along with this whole plan. He says, "I don't need the work, but I'm happy to make the introduction between Daisy and you again." And this is just one of those things that I always like to ask, what are your thoughts on this? Because ultimately, this is Nick, who is friends with Tom and friends with Gatsby, and he is now setting up a meeting between Tom's wife and his cousin with a man who clearly has romantic feelings for Daisy. So he's kind of hanging out third wheeling with Daisy and Gatsby this whole time, but at the same time he's actually the one arranging this meeting so that potentially Daisy can cheat on her husband. Now, Tom is the worst, so there's obviously some mitigating circumstances here. But he's still, this is a weird spot for him, and this is one of those spots where, again, I like to go back to the initial way that he describes himself, is he's almost sort of above judgment. He doesn't judge people, and that's why people are so willing to go to him. And that's still true here, but it's just kind of weird because by being sort of above judging people, he ends up not seeing their flaws. He's dating Jordan despite the fact that Jordan is a pretty terrible person. She's a cheater in golf. She's a reckless driver. She doesn't seem to care if she really hurts people or, affects them in some bad way. And Nick's just cool with that. He's cool with Tom, even though Tom is pretty horribly racist and, just a pretty bad guy. He's still cool with being friends with him. It's just strange that Nick is this way, but that is how Nick is. So then, of course, we get the Daisy showing up and Gatsby disappearing. Again, it's super awkward at first, and the big thing that I want to kind of get to this is that this is built up so much in his mind that, he has to get this right. That I often bring this up as a story of, I was a creative writing minor, and I always thought that, maybe I would do some writing. It was always one of those things that I expected to do, is just to keep writing. I didn't know whether I'd ever actually publish anything or not, but I wanted to be someone who was always writing, and I just don't get around to writing much anymore. I write some stuff occasionally, but not in the way that I expected to, with short stories and, maybe trying to write a novel or something. I've had ideas, but one is the time, but the other thing is it's just hard to overcome the fear of, what if I realize that I'm not good at this anymore? What if I realize that I can't do this? And then I can't think of myself as someone who could have done that, who maybe, if I just sat down and made time to write, that maybe I could write a novel. Well, what if I find out that I'm wrong? then that part of me that I like to hold on to is gone. Now, that's not a great reason not to do things, but that's kind of what Gatsby's doing here. That holding on to the dream, it's given him something to push forward for 5 years. Now he's at that moment. Now this is like, his equivalent of a championship game. What if you go out there and you screw it up? Then that was your one shot, potentially. So again, it is pretty super awkward at first, but once they do kind of get there, they kind of fall back into being the old versions of themselves. And I want to show this one scene. I'm going to skip ahead. If you've watched the movie, then you've probably seen this before, but let me get to the right spot here before I put it on the screen. Here we go, I think, yeah. And it's one that I usually refer to as the shirt scene. And it's just kind of a weird little scene. I'm just going to show you about 1 minute of the film here. But I'm going to put this on this screen. Oops. Nope, actually, that's not what I want to do. I'm doing this wrong. Okay, so I need to turn these things off. There we go. And again, this is the shirt scene, and I'm probably just going to talk over it for part of the time. But here we go.
In England, who buys me clothes?
I've never seen anything like it.
Something for the lady. Sends over a selection at the beginning of each season.
Jay!
These are silk.
Jay!
These are flannel.
They're so beautiful!
Indian cotton.
Stop it! Jay!
Linen.
Mickey, he's a madman!
I can't help you. Flannel.
You're going to have to refold every single one of them. You'll ruin them! Jay, stop it!
Right here.
No! Jay!
What is it?
Oh. So, there we go. Now I'm back. So, I think it cut off unless I just didn't hear it very well because the volume on my laptop is not very loud. I think it'll play louder in the video than it did for me. But there's a line she says at the end, "I've never seen such beautiful shirts." And there's another version of this film that's done with Robert Redford and Sam Waterston, both of whom are actors that I'm sure you know, but you may not recognize the names. Mia Farrow plays Daisy, another person that there's less chance that you'll know her. But regardless, the way they play the scene is just even more kind of over the top, and Mia Farrow just has this super high-pitched, kind of annoying voice, and she just reads it like, "I've never seen such beautiful shirts," and she's bawling her eyes out. And the whole thing just seems very silly. But the line means more than just shirts. It's not the shirts. It's that this is the life she could have had, and she could have had it with Daisy, someone that someone who adores her. Tom sees her as a person that is on her level for status, and that's basically it. That because they're on the same level status-wise, she is the match that he should have. And yes, he has affection for her. Yes, he probably has learned to love her on some level, but it's not a level of adoration and love that she's going to get from Gatsby. And that's the thing that she's missing here, is that she could have had this. Gatsby got there. Gatsby just wasn't there as fast. So that's one of the big key points, is this is her realizing that Gatsby did in fact get there. Gatsby could have given this life to her just as Tom has. So then the next chapter we get to James Gatz, and with James Gatz we get the truth. He's a nobody. Little parts of the story are true. He knew a guy named Dan Cody that kind of helped him get to where he was. He apparently, the medal's real, so obviously he's a war hero of some type, but I'm not so convinced he's gotten medals from every country. He probably has this one from Montenegro. The Oxford thing is a little bit true. He was there for a little bit because the American officers were allowed to go there as sort of a thank you for, helping in World War II. But he stayed there basically, it seems like, the equivalent of a semester. So it's really kind of that he took these little bits of truth and use those as the glue to hold together the lies in this mythology that he's made about himself. So that's a key point, is that he has built this mythology. There's a term that is perfect for this. Usually it's done in more of a derisive way, but it's called gaslighting. And if you don't know what gaslighting is the idea of just telling lies so often, telling a certain lie so often, that it sort of becomes accepted as truth because you've just said it so many times. And that's kind of what Gatsby does with his own past. And then we have the party, and Gatsby and Daisy are, they kind of disappear. Tom's kind of ticked off, but Tom's there. And, like, Tom being there, I think, is kind of the thing in the background that kind of messes with this, because at the end, Gatsby is convinced that Daisy didn't have a good time. Not like Chapter 5. Chapter 5, they were back in their magic. It was like those 5 years never happened. And that's what Gatsby wants. He wants it as though those 5 years never happened. So at the end, Nick says, "I wouldn't ask too much of her. You can't repeat the past." And Gatsby says, "Can't repeat the past? Well, of course you can." And this really does get to the idea of Gatsby's optimism, his optimism that he thinks he can make the world in his own image. In fact, it really does get to a powerful line that it says earlier when he's talking about the version of himself, the James Gatt story. This is a quote from page 98 in our version of the book. It says, "The truth was that J. Gatsby of West Egg, Long Island, sprang from his platonic conception of himself. He was a son of God, a phrase which, if it means anything, means just that. And he must be about his father's business, the service of a vast, vulgar, and meretricious beauty. So he invented just the sort of J. Gatsby that a 17-year-old boy would be likely to invent. And to this conception, he was faithful to the end." So he just makes this version of himself, and he just goes after it, and he makes himself into that. Some of it required lies, but he just makes himself into that. For lack of a better way of putting this, it's almost kind of the idea of like, if you've seen the movie, Aladdin, that he wishes to be a prince, and then he's got all these lies. There's some truth to it, because obviously the magic has given him all these things, but he's still just a guy. And he has to create this backstory in order to get to that, but that's kind of the key point here, is that he just kind of lives up to the lie and makes this mythology, and now he wants to gaslight Daisy's past too, because he wants to repeat the past. He wants to wipe out those 5 years. He wants to make it to where Tom and all the stuff with Tom never happened, and that's what you're going to start seeing in the next few chapters, that it's going to be a battle between Daisy's past, whether it can be erased or not. And that's kind of where we start to go with chapters, especially Chapter 7, which Chapter 7 probably is the big climactic point, and then after that, things start to wind down in 8 and 9. That's where we'll be going next week. We'll finish up just before spring break. We'll do a little bit of this once we get back from spring break, and then we're going to move into other stuff. But that's where we're at. Hope you're enjoying Gatsby.